"Don't ruin my big day, Mom." That's what she said lightly, as if it were a joke, while she adjusted her veil in the mirror and avoided meeting my eyes. It wasn't meant to be cruel, I think, at least not consciously, but there was a firmness behind the softness of her tone, a final reminder that I was expected to remain quiet, invisible, appropriately proud, but never central. The words stayed in the air like perfume after someone leaves the room, sweet at first, but clinging too long. I smiled the way mothers are supposed to smile, the way you do when your daughter is radiant and nervous, and you don't want to dim her glow with the shadow of your feelings. I said nothing. I have learned over time that saying nothing often keeps the peace, even when it breaks something else inside you. I am 74 now. I live alone by a small river where herons come at dawn. I have learned to wake without waiting for anyone to call my name. But that morning, as I sat in the rented guest house beside the wedding venue, I felt like an intruder in my own story. I had flown in 2 days earlier, carrying a suitcase small enough to fit in an overhead compartment because I was told not to bring much. Everything would be taken care of. My daughter had arranged the room, the transportation, even the outfit I was supposed to wear. Neutral tones, nothing too formal, she had texted. There was no malice in the message, just an efficient kind of control, the tone of someone who manages people for a living and has learned to keep things streamlined. I didn't argue. I never do when it comes to her. She was my only child, the single miracle that survived a decade of miscarriages and silent prayers whispered into empty cribs. You don't argue with your miracle, even when she becomes the one who makes you feel unnecessary. The morning of the wedding was clear and windless, a day photographers pray for. The sky held the kind of even light that makes everything look expensive. I woke early, unable to sleep past dawn, and made tea with the electric kettle someone had left on the counter. The house was quiet, except for the low hum of the refrigerator. I had brought my own cup, a porcelain one with a tiny crack along the rim. My late husband used to tease me for keeping broken things, but I always said cracks don't make something useless. They make it lived in. As I poured the water, I caught my reflection in the window. Soft skin that had folded in on itself, gray hair pinned carefully but without much volume, eyes that had seen both birth and burial. I looked like a guest at a life I used to host. When I arrived at the venue, the air was heavy with perfume and expectation. The coordinator, a young woman in black with a headset, asked for my name and checked her clipboard before pointing me toward a small waiting room labeled family. Inside, there were cousins I barely recognized, 2 of my daughter's colleagues, and a man from her husband's side arranging boutonnieres. Everyone moved quickly, efficiently, like bees in an organized hive. My daughter entered a few minutes later, glowing, transformed by silk and light. For a moment, my throat tightened with pride so sharp it hurt. She was beautiful in the way only someone untouched by loss can be. When she saw me, her smile wavered, just a little, as though my presence startled her. "Oh, Mom, you're ready early," she said, then glanced toward the stylist. "Maybe you could wait outside until they're done with the photos. We're still setting up." I nodded, still holding the small corsage they'd given me, white roses and eucalyptus. It looked delicate, but smelled faintly artificial, like something made to last longer than it should. I stepped into the hallway, careful not to touch the walls. Through the open door, I could hear laughter, clinking glasses, instructions about poses. Every sound from that room belonged to youth, and I was outside of it, listening like someone pressed to the glass of a memory. In moments like that, time folds. I remembered her as a child, trying on my shoes, smearing lipstick across her face, calling me queen, and insisting I dance with her in the kitchen. I remembered the nights I worked double shifts at the hospital to afford her violin lessons, the afternoons I sat in the car outside her friend's house because she didn't want me to come in. I remembered the year she stopped hugging me first. These things don't happen in a single day. They accumulate like dust in corners you stop noticing until sunlight catches it just right. Standing in that hallway, I could see all the years I had mistaken distance for independence. When the ceremony began, I was led to my seat by a polite usher who addressed me as ma'am. Second row, left side, behind the stepmother of the groom, who introduced herself with the bright smile of a woman who collects social advantages the way others collect stamps. "Lovely day for it," she said, and I agreed, though my throat ached. From where I sat, I could see my daughter only in profile. The officiant spoke words about love, about union, about honoring those who raised us. My hands lay folded on my lap, motionless. I waited for my name, my role, my mention. It never came. I thought of saying something, perhaps standing up at the end to offer a blessing, but the moment passed like all moments do when you've trained yourself to avoid disruption. The reception was even louder, music, laughter, clinking glasses, the kind of noise that leaves no room for quiet reflection. I smiled when people took pictures. I nodded when strangers thanked me for coming, though none of them knew who I was beyond the mother of the bride. She introduced me twice, quickly, as if fulfilling a social obligation. I drank a single glass of champagne and tried to taste celebration. It felt hollow on my tongue. Around dessert time, she leaned over and whispered, "Everything okay, Mom? You're quiet." I wanted to tell her that quietness was all she'd left me, that silence had become my inheritance. Instead, I said, "Everything's perfect." She smiled, relieved, and turned back to her friends. Later, I slipped out onto the terrace. The night was soft and warm, the kind of air that makes the skin remember youth. From inside, I could still hear the music, the laughter, her voice. I watched her through the window, twirling, radiant, unaware, and I thought, not with bitterness, but with clarity, that this was her big day, her curated beginning, and I had no right to ruin it by asking for space in it. I finished my champagne, placed the empty glass on the railing, and walked toward the parking lot without telling anyone. My shoes clicked softly against the stone path. No one called after me. I suppose they assumed I had gone to rest. Now, sitting here by the river, months later, I sometimes wonder if anyone noticed when I left. Maybe they saw the empty chair and thought I'd gone to the restroom. Maybe they assumed someone else was keeping me company. That's how it often happens. We disappear politely, quietly, under the hum of other people's joy. But I don't feel angry anymore. There's a strange relief in recognizing that you no longer owe anyone the performance of belonging. My daughter will always be my child, but she no longer needs a mother. She needs an audience. And I, finally, have stopped auditioning. That night after the wedding, I returned to the small rented room they had booked for me, a quiet space above a bakery that smelled faintly of sugar and yeast, even in the dark. The music from the venue was still echoing somewhere in the distance, muffled through the walls like the sound of a celebration happening in another life. I took off my shoes and sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing the pale dress my daughter had chosen for me. My feet ached, but it wasn't from standing. It was from holding myself together for hours, from keeping every smile measured and every breath steady. I looked down at my hands, at the small tremor that had begun years ago and never really left. It struck me that these hands had once buttoned her school uniforms, braided her hair before exams, and packed her lunches even when I could barely afford groceries. Tonight, They had held nothing but a glass of sparkling water because the champagne made me dizzy and I didn't want anyone to fuss. The room was still and ordinary, one lamp, a small table, a thin curtain that couldn't keep out the city lights. I found myself wishing it were raining, because rain has a way of giving sadness something to hide behind. But the sky was cruelly clear, the moon indifferent. On the bedside table lay the corsage she had given me, its petals already beginning to curl at the edges. I tried to remember if she had hugged me before the ceremony, and I couldn't. I could remember the scent of her perfume, a mix of jasmine and something metallic, but not the weight of her arms. It's strange how the body forgets what the heart wants to hold on to. For years, I told myself that all the sacrifices were just part of love's arithmetic. You give, they grow, and one day they understand. That night, I realized love's math doesn't always balance. Some debts are never acknowledged, not out of cruelty, but because the receiver has come to believe the gift was theirs all along. It was never an exchange. It was expectation turned invisible. I thought of all the times I had said yes when I wanted to say no, all the dinners I cooked when I was too tired to stand, all the quiet apologies I made for simply existing in a space that had decided it was too modern for mothers. I had mistaken endurance for harmony, silence for grace. The bakery downstairs began its early work around midnight. I could hear the low rumble of ovens, the metallic clatter of trays. The world keeps baking bread no matter whose heart is breaking above it. I stood by the window and looked down at the empty street. A cat crossed the road, unhurried, like it owned the night. I envied its indifference. For 74 years, I had measured my worth through usefulness. Even when my husband died, even when I retired from the hospital, I found small ways to stay essential, helping neighbors with their errands, knitting blankets for the shelter, sending care packages to my daughter during her first years of marriage. I was always contributing, proving, earning my place. Tonight, I began to wonder what would happen if I simply stopped. It wasn't a loud realization. It came like the soft click of a door I didn't know was open. Somewhere between midnight and dawn, the word enough surfaced in my mind, not as anger, but as a simple truth. Enough of waiting to be invited into rooms that were built with my effort, but not my name. Enough of apologizing for taking up space. Enough of pretending that being left out was the same as being independent. The thought frightened me at first. Freedom does when you've lived too long behind the curtain of obligation. But once the fear passed, there was a calm I hadn't felt in decades. I sat down at the little table and began to write. Not a letter, not yet, but a list. I wrote down the things that belonged to me alone. The small pension that still came each month, the books I had kept through every move, the recipes my husband and I had written on napkins, the quiet mornings when no one needed anything from me. As I wrote, my handwriting steadied. Each line felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I had lent out too freely. When I finished, I folded the paper and tucked it into my purse. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. At 4 a.m, I made tea with the kettle in the corner of the room. The water boiled slowly, whispering rather than hissing, as if it understood that this was a sacred hour. I sipped it without sugar, listening to the bakery come fully alive beneath me. The smell of bread rose through the floorboards, warm, human, forgiving. It reminded me that life doesn't stop for anyone's heartbreak. It just changes flavor. I decided I would leave the next day, not in a dramatic way, not as an escape, but as a quiet correction. I would take a train to the coast, somewhere small where no one knew my name, and I would begin again. It sounded absurd at first, 74 and starting over, but so is spending a lifetime waiting for recognition that never arrives. Before lying down, I looked once more at the corsage. I thought about keeping it, but something in me hesitated. It felt wrong to preserve a symbol of obligation. I carried it to the sink and let the water run over it until the glue loosened and the petals slipped apart, swirling down the drain like tiny white ghosts. There was no ceremony, no tears, just a quiet motion of letting go. I dried my hands, turned off the lamp, and lay down. The moon had shifted higher, cutting a stripe of light across the room. I watched the shadow move across the wall until sleep came. When I woke, the world was still ordinary, but I was not. I packed slowly, folding the dress with care, though I knew I would never wear it again. I left the key on the table and one of the envelopes with my payment for the room. On the back of the receipt, I wrote a single line. Thank you for the quiet. Outside, the air smelled of yeast and rain that hadn't yet fallen. The bakery door was propped open. The baker, a man about my daughter's age, nodded at me as I passed. Early start? He asked. I smiled. Late finish. He laughed, not knowing how true that was. I walked to the station with no destination in mind, just the need to move. The streets were empty, the morning birds louder than usual, as if cheering for someone no one noticed. I bought a ticket to the first coastal town on the list, a place I'd never heard of. As the train pulled away, I watched the city shrink into a blur of color and memory. I didn't cry. I didn't even feel sad. What I felt was something quieter, more honest, a sense that I was finally stepping into the part of my life that belonged only to me. The train carried me north, along a line of small towns and open fields that looked half asleep beneath the pale morning light. I watched the scenery move like a slow film through the window, the horizon unfolding with that particular indifference landscapes have when they don't care who is watching. I wasn't running away, though it might have looked that way to anyone who saw me sitting there with a single suitcase and a face too old to pretend this was adventure. I was simply continuing, because stopping felt like the only real form of surrender left. When the train reached the coast, I stepped out into air that smelled of salt and rain and something metallic from the harbor. The station was small, with a single bench painted blue, and a ticket clerk who seemed surprised to see anyone get off there. That surprise comforted me somehow. I had spent years being expected. It felt almost luxurious to be unexpected again. The town was modest, lined with narrow streets where paint peeled off the shutters and cats ruled the rooftops. I found a room above a florist's shop that advertised short-term stays in its window. The owner, a woman named Judith, had the calm, weathered face of someone who has learned to mind her own business. She showed me a small space at the back, with a window that overlooked a courtyard of potted geraniums and laundry lines. It's quiet, she said, mostly because everyone else has better places to be. I nodded, understanding perfectly. The bed creaked when I sat down. The floor smelled faintly of dust and petals. I unpacked slowly, arranging the few things I owned in a way that made them feel intentional. My books went on the windowsill, my sweater over the chair, my teacup by the sink. There is a strange peace in organizing small spaces. They obey you when people no longer do. For the first few days, I walked without purpose. The sea was only 2 blocks away, a gray expanse that changed color with the hour. I would sit on the promenade with a paper cup of coffee and watch gulls fight over crumbs. Sometimes couples strolled past holding hands. Sometimes old men argued about fishing rights. Nobody knew my name, and that anonymity was a relief and a punishment at once. The silence stretched wider than I expected. At night, when the town shut down and the shops pulled their shutters, I found myself listening for the noises of a life that wasn't there. No phone ringing, no one calling for me from another room. Freedom is quieter than people imagine. It can turn heavy when you have no one to share it with. On the fourth evening, Judith knocked on my door to tell me about the bakery at the corner that sold discounted bread after closing. "You look like someone who appreciates not wasting things," she said. I thanked her, and the next day I went. The bakery was run by a man named Eli, short, thick-armed, with a kindness that wasn't loud. He sold me a loaf still warm from the oven and asked where I was from. "A long way," I said. He nodded as if that explained everything. It did, really. Some people don't need details. They recognize the geography of departure in your face. That night, I ate the bread with butter and felt, for the first time in weeks, the dull comfort of being fed by my own hands. Days folded into one another. I began to read again, to write small notes on scraps of paper I never intended to send. I watched the tide and started learning its moods, the stubborn stillness before dawn, the sighing pull at dusk. Life became simple, but simplicity can turn into solitude if you aren't careful. I realized how much of my routine still revolved around the invisible outline of others. I prepared extra tea, as if someone might knock on the door, folded napkins in pairs, left the hallway light on when I went to bed. It's astonishing how habits remain, even when their reasons have long gone. One afternoon, I walked into the library. It was small, with the comforting smell of old paper and disuse. The librarian, a young woman with hair like a storm cloud, smiled when I asked for a card. "We don't get many new faces," she said. "Are you visiting?" "Something like that," I answered. I borrowed a book of poems, though I knew I might not read it right away. The act of borrowing felt important, the small permission to take something and promise to return it, a quiet exchange of trust. When I left, I noticed a corkboard by the door with faded notices: piano lessons, dog walking, a missing cat. One of them read, "Community garden volunteers needed." The handwriting was shaky, like someone unused to asking for help. I tore off one of the tabs with the phone number. That evening I called. The voice that answered belonged to a man named Henry, old enough that his consonants carried the weight of habit. "We meet Saturdays at 9, he said. "Don't worry about tools. We've got spares." I showed up that weekend, nervous like a child on her first day of school. The garden was behind the library, a rectangle of earth hemmed by chain-link fencing. A handful of people worked there, mostly retirees, one college student, a woman with a straw hat who hummed hymns while she pulled weeds. They greeted me without questions, which was a kind of grace. I spent the morning planting seedlings, feeling the dirt crumble under my nails, the air full of earth and sun. By the time we stopped for tea, my back ached and my heart felt unexpectedly lighter. It became my rhythm. I tended small patches of soil, watered what others had planted, and learned to wait for things to grow again. The town began to feel less like a hiding place and more like a pause between chapters. Still, there were evenings when loneliness returned uninvited. It would creep in during supper, when the light thinned and the radio played songs from decades ago. I would think of my daughter then, not with anger, but with an ache too complicated to name. I wondered if she was happy, if she thought of me, if the wedding photos had turned out well. Sometimes I imagined her scrolling through pictures, noticing the gap where her mother should have stood, and then convincing herself it was better that way. I never checked. The phone remained off, tucked in the bottom of my bag like a secret I wasn't ready to face. One night, Judith joined me in the kitchen while I brewed tea. She sat across from me and asked, not unkindly, "You staying long?" I hesitated. "I don't know," I said. I came here to breathe. I suppose I'll leave when I stop gasping." She nodded, understanding in the way only people who've lost things understand. We sat in silence, the kind that doesn't demand filling. Later, when I went to my room, I realized the ache in my chest had shifted. It wasn't emptiness anymore, but space. Space for something that might one day grow. Winter came softly, creeping through the cracks in the window and into my bones. The sea turned darker, heavier. The town quieted even more, tourists gone, shops closing early. I bought a thicker coat from a thrift store, one that smelled faintly of cedar. Every morning I wrapped myself in it and walked along the shore. The cold sharpened everything, the air, the memory, the will to keep moving. Sometimes I picked up shells and placed them on the windowsill, a small collection of proof that even broken things can still be found beautiful by someone willing to look closely. It was during one of those walks that I realized how strange it was to have built a life so entirely around being unseen. Even now, after leaving, I caught myself apologizing to strangers who brushed past me, stepping aside when no one asked me to. The invisibility wasn't something done to me anymore. It was something I carried out of habit, like a coat I forgot to take off. The realization unsettled me. I had escaped the setting, but not the role. The quiet that once soothed me now pressed like weight on my ribs. Something had to shift again, though I didn't yet know how. The first escalation wasn't dramatic. It rarely is. It was the slow recognition that solitude can become its own form of disappearance, and that peace, if left unchecked, turns into numbness. The small room above the florist shop, once a refuge, began to feel like another waiting room, and I had spent enough of my life waiting. The first sign that something inside me was changing came one morning in late February, when I woke before dawn and didn't reach immediately for the robe hanging by the bed. The air was sharp, and for once I didn't hurry to protect myself from it. I stood by the window in my nightgown, watching the gray horizon soften into pale blue, and I thought, I am still here. It was not a grand thought, not even comforting at first, but it was real, like a pulse returning after a long sleep. The geraniums in the courtyard had shriveled from frost, yet a few stubborn leaves still held on, dark and waxy. I realized that I, too, had been surviving on a kind of inner stubbornness, feeding myself with tiny doses of hope I hadn't dared to name. That morning I decided to act, not from bitterness, but from a quiet curiosity about who I might become if I stopped shrinking. I began by rearranging the room. It sounds trivial, but after months of living as though I were only borrowing space, it felt radical to claim it. I moved the chair to face the window, replaced the faded curtain with a deep green one from the thrift shop, and pinned my small collection of shells along the windowsill in a straight, deliberate line. Judith noticed the changes and smiled when she passed my door. "Looks more lived in," she said. "Finally," I answered, surprising us both with how light my voice sounded. That afternoon, I walked to the community garden, though the ground was still hard and the beds bare. Henry was there, as always, pruning something that looked dead, but probably wasn't. "It's early," he said without looking up. "So am I," I replied, and he chuckled. We worked in silence for a while, two figures bent over the stubborn earth, both old enough to know that patience is the only prayer that gets answered regularly. When the sun broke through the clouds, I felt it on my face and thought about warmth as something you have to meet halfway. For years I had waited for it to find me, as if affection, purpose, and joy were weather patterns that came on their own schedule. But maybe they were fires you had to build yourself with the flint of small choices. That day, I signed up for 2 more volunteer shifts at the library garden, and the following week, I started helping Judith in her flower shop when deliveries were heavy. It was modest work, trimming stems, wrapping bouquets, sweeping petals from the floor, but there was something deeply satisfying in it. My hands, which had spent so long doing for others, were finally doing for beauty. Flowers don't need your history. They just need your attention. In March, the town began to stir again. Tourists hadn't yet returned, but the air carried the faint hum of anticipation. I walked to the pier each morning, passing fishermen who greeted me with nods instead of words. It was enough. I started carrying a small notebook in my pocket, jotting down fragments, lines that came without warning, memories that no longer hurt as sharply. Once, while sitting on a bench overlooking the water, I wrote, "You can't go back to being unbroken, but you can learn to belong to the cracks." I didn't know where it came from, but the sentence felt like something I'd been waiting to hear. The shift deepened quietly. I began cooking again, not out of obligation, but pleasure. I bought vegetables at the market, bargained for them just to feel the dance of small negotiation, and filled the room with the smell of garlic and thyme. Judith started joining me for dinner once or twice a week. We talked about nothing urgent, weather, recipes, small gossip about neighbors, but our companionship steadied me. The silence between us became friendly, not heavy. It was she who first suggested I attend the community evening at the local art hall, where people gathered once a month to share music, readings, or simply listen. "You don't have to speak," she said, "but sometimes being in a room where others are brave reminds you that you could be too." I went, sitting in the back, heart drumming like a secret. The evening was uneven, some poems awkward, a guitar slightly out of tune, but it was alive. When one woman read a story about growing tomatoes on her apartment balcony after her husband left, the room exhaled as one body. I didn't clap immediately because I was busy swallowing the lump in my throat. After that night, I started to write longer pieces, small reflections that were not quite stories, but not just memories either. Words became a way of watering the parts of me I had neglected. I didn't show them to anyone, not even Judith, but the act itself changed my posture toward the world. It felt like standing upright after years of bending. Henry noticed it one morning at the garden. "You look taller," he said. "I didn't think that was possible at our age." I smiled. "Maybe it's just the soil giving back." April brought a storm that lasted 3 days. The sea grew wild, the wind howled through every crack in the window, and the electricity flickered in protest. I stayed indoors, wrapped in my blanket, reading by candlelight. It was then that I realized how little fear I felt. Once, such weather would have unsettled me, the reminder of how easily the world can shake. But now it felt like a conversation between equals. The storm raged, I brewed tea, and we both survived the night. When morning came, the air smelled clean, and the sky looked scrubbed of doubt. I walked outside to find that most of the geraniums had been flattened, but in their place, tiny green shoots were already pushing through. Renewal never asks for permission, it simply insists. That week, Judith asked if I would mind watching the shop while she attended her sister's birthday. "It's just for the afternoon," she said, handing me the keys. I agreed, though the idea of being responsible again, even briefly, made my stomach flutter. When she left, I stood behind the counter, surrounded by buckets of tulips and roses, listening to the ticking of the clock. A young couple came in looking for flowers for their anniversary. I helped them choose a bouquet of white lilies and yellow ranunculus, wrapping them carefully in brown paper. As they left, the woman said, "You have a gentle way about you." I thanked her, but after she left, I found myself sitting down, unexpectedly moved. It had been years since anyone described me with kindness that didn't carry duty in its tone. By the end of the day, I realized I didn't want to return to passivity. There was still quiet in me, but it was the calm of readiness, not resignation. That evening, I took the notebook from my pocket and wrote a single line in larger handwriting than usual. If I could survive being forgotten, I can survive being found. I didn't know exactly what it meant yet, only that it was true. Something inside me had shifted from surviving toward seeking, from endurance toward expression. As spring unfolded, I began teaching Judith's niece how to arrange flowers for the summer fair. She was a nervous girl of 17, always apologizing for clumsy fingers. I told her, "Nothing you touch gently will ever be a mistake." The words came out before I could think them through, but she smiled as if they mattered. Later, I realized they were meant for me too. I had spent a lifetime believing that gentleness required invisibility, but perhaps gentleness could also be a form of presence, a steady, unshakable kind. The thought felt like sunlight settling into a place that had been dimmed too long. The midpoint of my story, if I had to name it, was not marked by triumph or revelation, but by this simple truth. I was no longer waiting to be invited into my own life. I had opened the door quietly and stepped inside. The summer arrived without ceremony, sliding in through the cracks of ordinary days, until one morning I realized the air itself had changed. The sea smelled sweeter, the pavement shimmered earlier, and people moved slower, as if time had decided to lounge along with them. My life had grown into a quiet rhythm that required no audience. I woke with the light, opened the shop with Judith, arranged tulips and daisies into neat bundles, and watched strangers carry them away to other lives. In the afternoons, I walked to the garden, tended the soil, and stayed long enough to feel the sun's weight soften toward evening. It was a life made of small tasks and slower thoughts, the kind that leaves you content enough to forget you were ever desperate for meaning. For a while, I believed that calm would last, but peace is a fragile tenant. It can leave without a word. It began one afternoon in early July, when Judith returned from the post office holding a single envelope. "For you," she said. My name was written across it in looping script I hadn't seen in years, elegant and slightly self-conscious, the handwriting of someone who rehearses being polite. There was no return address, but I knew. My daughter's handwriting had always carried that same blend of control and performance. For a moment I considered not opening it, just tucking it into a drawer and letting it fade. But curiosity can masquerade as forgiveness. I tore the edge carefully and unfolded the pages inside. Her tone was measured, almost professional. She wrote that she had seen pictures of coastal markets online and wondered if it was my kind of place. She hoped I was comfortable and said that her husband was considering visiting the region for a business retreat. At the end, she added, "You are always welcome if you wish to come home." The word home caught in my throat like a fishbone. Home, the place she had built by removing every trace of me. I folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope, sliding it under the stack of newspapers by the door. That night, I dreamt of standing in her house again, surrounded by white walls and muted voices, and woke with the taste of dust in my mouth. For days, I pretended the letter hadn't arrived. I filled my hours with work, with chatter about flowers, with the satisfaction of tired hands. But silence doesn't erase. It merely delays the echo. The thought of her stayed with me, moving in and out of focus. Sometimes I pictured her walking through a polished kitchen, her hair pinned the way she used to do before exams, her voice carrying that crisp certainty I once mistook for strength. Sometimes I imagined her sitting at her computer, rewriting our history in careful phrases, telling herself she had been a good daughter and that I had chosen distance out of stubborn pride. It was easier for her that way, I suppose. The mind rearranges memory to fit the furniture of guilt. Still, I wondered if she meant the invitation, or if it was a test to see whether I would appear and prove her right, that I couldn't live without orbiting her world. Henry noticed my distraction at the garden. "You're pruning too hard," he said. "The plant won't know what to do with itself." I laughed, but his words stayed with me. That evening, I sat by the window, looking at the shell line I'd made months ago. They had gathered a thin layer of dust. I brushed them off one by one, and when I reached the last one, a small spiral the color of honey, I found myself whispering, "I forgive you." I didn't know if I meant her or myself, maybe both. Forgiveness, I've learned, is never tidy. It doesn't close the door. It only lets you walk past it without shattering. The next morning brought a second letter, forwarded from my old address by the pension office. This one was from my granddaughter. The handwriting was smaller, rounder, alive. She wrote that she had found some old photographs in a box, pictures of her as a toddler sitting on my lap, both of us laughing at something out of frame. "I didn't remember this," she wrote, "but I can tell you loved me. That single line undid me more than any apology could have. Love, recognized across time, is its own resurrection." I read the letter 3 times before folding it carefully and tucking it into my notebook. It reminded me that the past wasn't only made of absence. It also contained proof of presence. Days passed. Tourists filled the town, crowding the pier with cameras and careless laughter. The florist's shop grew busier, our hands stained with pollen and tape glue. I watched Judith manage it all with her usual calm, and one afternoon between customers she asked, "You going to answer whoever's writing to you?" I told her maybe. She nodded, as if she'd expected that answer. "Just don't let your story get written without you again," she said. "Even silence gets interpreted." That night, I thought about what she'd said. I pulled out my daughter's letter again, read it slowly, and then began to write, not to her, but for myself. I wrote about the day I left the wedding, about the silence of the train, about the first time I felt unburdened by someone else's narrative. The words came without pause, like water finding its path. When I finished, I realized the act itself was enough. I didn't need to send it, but life has a way of testing your resolve. A week later, Judith fell ill, a stubborn infection that kept her in bed for days. I managed the shop in her absence, learning to handle the customers, the invoices, the endless small decisions that make a place breathe. It was exhausting and strangely exhilarating. Responsibility, once heavy, now felt like proof that I still belonged to the world. One afternoon, as I was closing up, a woman entered carrying a bouquet from another shop, asking if I could fix it. "It doesn't look alive," she said apologetically. I rearranged it for her, replacing wilted stems with fresh ones, and when she smiled at the result, I realized how much I'd missed being needed for something other than history. Later that evening, while counting the till, I thought of how easy it would be to stay in this town indefinitely. But just as the thought settled, the phone on the counter rang. It startled me. The shop phone rarely rang after hours. I hesitated before answering. "Is this Mrs. Holt?" a man's voice asked. I hadn't heard that name in months. "Yes," I said. "Who's calling?" There was a pause. Then, "This is Daniel from St. Andrew's Hospital. We have your daughter listed as your emergency contact. She gave us this number. We need to confirm. My heart clenched. I interrupted. I'm not her emergency contact anymore. There must be a mistake. Another pause, then a softened tone. All right, ma'am, thank you. We'll update our records. He hung up, leaving me with the sound of the dial tone and a rush of conflicting thoughts. She had listed me still. After all this time, in some official form, buried in a hospital file. I was still her call in case of crisis. The realization didn't bring relief. It brought confusion, tenderness, fear, and a flicker of something that felt dangerously close to hope. I sat for a long time after that, listening to the sea's distant pulse beyond the window. The phone call had cracked the shell of my calm. For days I moved through routines like a woman rehearsing her own role, but my thoughts returned again and again to her face, her voice. I began to imagine scenarios, none of them certain, all of them tinted with guilt. Was she ill? Was she simply updating records and the clerk had confused names? Did she even know they had called me? Every question felt like a thread, and I was tugging at them all. Finally, after nearly a week of restless half-sleep, I walked to the post office, bought a simple card, and wrote a few lines. I hope you are well. I am safe and content. Take care of yourself. I didn't sign it with love. I simply signed it, Mother. I dropped it in the outgoing box before I could change my mind. The following days felt different, lighter, oddly enough. I had made contact with the past, but on my terms. I kept working, tending the garden, laughing with Judith when she returned to health. The world seemed to breathe again, but just as I began to believe that equilibrium had returned, a shadow crossed it. Late in August, a stranger came into the shop, a man in his 50s with a kind but cautious expression. "Excuse me," he said, "are you Martha Holt?" The name, my full name, spoken aloud after so long, sounded foreign. "Who's asking?" I said, not unkindly. He explained that he was visiting from the city, that he had been asked by a family member to check that I was well. He spoke in careful tones, the language of people who don't want to alarm. I realized then that my daughter had sent him. "Tell her I'm alive," I said, keeping my voice steady, "and tell her I prefer it that way." He hesitated, perhaps waiting for permission to say more, but I turned back to the counter, signaling the end. When he left, I locked the door behind him and leaned against it, trembling, not with fear, but with the old exhaustion of being someone else's unfinished business. That night, I couldn't sleep. The air was heavy, the room too small for the past it suddenly contained. I thought about the line between concern and control, how thin it can be, how easily love turns into supervision. I had wanted to believe that distance would grant me peace, but peace, it seems, requires boundaries that keep being tested. Near dawn, I rose, made tea, and wrote again in my notebook. You can love someone and still choose silence. You can wish them well and still walk away. Writing it down felt like anchoring a truth that might otherwise drift. The next morning, Judith found me rearranging the window display with new flowers. "You look like you've been up all night," she said. "I have," I replied, smiling faintly. "But I think I finally know where I live." She raised an eyebrow. "You mean here?" "I mean inside my own skin." She nodded slowly, understanding. The day unfolded quietly after that, the way most turning points do, without thunder, just light shifting slightly, revealing what was already there. By September, the heat softened, tourists began to leave, and the town exhaled. I walked along the shore more often, each tide pulling a little more restlessness out of me. I still didn't know if another letter would come, but I no longer feared it. The sea had taught me that some things return, not to reclaim you, but to remind you of your shape. I was ready to keep standing, whether or not anyone called my name. The autumn light came quietly, like someone entering a room already full of memories. The sea turned silver instead of blue, the air sharper, more honest. The tourists were gone, the town returning to its slower pulse. I could hear the change in everything, the way the shutters creaked differently, the way gulls cried farther from shore, the way people spoke softer as if they were tired from the long brightness of summer. It was in this gentler season that I began to feel a new restlessness rising inside me. It wasn't unhappiness, not exactly, but a sense that I had been rehearsing peace rather than living it. I had built safety around me, brick by careful brick, but safety is not the same as freedom. Freedom asks you to move, to risk losing what you've built for something that breathes deeper. One morning I went to the garden earlier than usual. The ground was cold, the earth damp, and the last of the dahlias were beginning to fade. Henry arrived later, carrying a thermos of tea, and sat beside me on the low stone wall. We didn't speak for a while. Then he said, "You've been looking at the horizon more than the soil lately." I smiled because he was right. "Sometimes," I said, "you need to know what the edge looks like." He nodded, unscrewed the thermos, and poured us both a cup. The tea was strong, smoky, grounding. "Edges are just where the view changes," he said. That thought stayed with me long after he left. I walked along the water that afternoon, my hands deep in my coat pockets. The sea was calm, reflecting the sky like a patient mirror. I thought about how much of my life had been spent caring for others, waiting for recognition, believing that love meant permanence. But now love felt different, less like ownership and more like release. I wanted to do something that would mark the change, something irreversible but kind. I stopped by the post office on my way back, bought a stack of envelopes, and that evening began to write. I wrote to my daughter first, but not as an explanation or a plea. I wrote with the steadiness of someone who no longer needed to be understood in order to exist. I told her that I hoped she was well, that I had found peace by the sea, that I no longer measured my life by proximity to hers. I wrote that love, at its best, allows room for distance, and that my silence had never been punishment, only a boundary I needed to survive. I told her she didn't need to carry guilt or justification anymore, that I wasn't angry, only grateful for what had been true between us once. I ended simply, "I wish you happiness that does not require forgetting anyone who helped you reach it." Then I folded the pages, sealed the envelope, and placed it beside me. Next, I wrote to my granddaughter. That letter was shorter but warmer. I told her that memory is a living thing, that even photographs can't capture what really connects people. I told her that I saw her kindness in the way she had reached across years to write to me, and that kindness, not blood, is what keeps the world turning. I slipped a small pressed flower inside, one from the garden I tended with my own hands. When I finished, I felt lighter, as though I had placed 2 heavy stones gently on the shore and stepped back to watch the tide take them. I didn't mail the letters immediately. They sat on my table for 2 days, and during that time I realized that what I had written wasn't only for them, it was also for myself, proof that I could speak my truth without bitterness. On the 3rd day, I carried them to the post office. The clerk, a quiet woman with silver hair, weighed them and said, "These are going far?" "Yes," I replied, "but not as far as they used to." After leaving the post office, I didn't go home. I kept walking until the road turned out of town and the fields opened into a wide view of the sea. The wind was sharp but clear, carrying the smell of salt and grass. I sat on a low stone fence and watched the waves. For the first time, I didn't think of the past as something behind me. It was beneath me, like the earth itself, solid, carrying me, allowing me to walk forward. I took out my notebook and began to write again, not letters this time, but plans. I wrote that I would travel north to a town where an old friend from my nursing days lived. I hadn't spoken to her in years, but she had sent me a postcard once saying, "If you ever find your courage again, bring it here." I realized it was time. That evening, I told Judith. She listened quietly, then smiled. "You were never meant to stay still," she said. "Some people bloom once, others keep blooming in different gardens." Her words filled the room like sunlight. We shared tea and laughter, and when I went to bed, the decision felt rooted, not impulsive. I packed lightly, the same suitcase I had carried when I left the wedding, now worn at the corners but still dependable. On the morning I was to leave, Henry came by the shop. He handed me a small jar of soil from the garden. "For when you miss this place," he said, "plant something wherever you go. It'll remind you that you can make things grow anywhere." I hugged him, something I rarely did, and he held me just long enough for the gesture to mean what words couldn't. Judith gave me a small bundle of dried lavender wrapped in brown paper. "For calm," she said. I smiled. "For memory," I answered. At the station, as the train arrived, I hesitated for a moment, not out of fear, but reverence. Every departure deserves a pause, a breath between what was and what will be. The doors opened with a sigh, and I stepped inside. The seat was near the window. The landscape began to move, familiar fields turning into blurs of green and gold. I watched the coastline recede and felt a quiet certainty settle in me. There was no going back, but there didn't need to be. Somewhere between stations, as the sun angled through the window, I thought about how the world had once felt too large for me, how I used to shrink myself to fit inside other people's expectations. Now, the vastness no longer frightened me. It felt like belonging. I took the jar of soil from my bag, held it in my hands, and whispered, "Thank you," to no one and everyone at once. That was the moment of my return, not to anyone else, but to myself. The years of silence, the long ache of invisibility, the small kindnesses that had stitched me back together, they had all led here, to this unremarkable train moving steadily toward an open horizon. I didn't know what awaited me, but I knew who would arrive. And for the first time in a very long time, that was enough. The train arrived at the northern town just before dusk. The light was softer there, stretched thin across the hills, and the air carried that first chill of oncoming winter. I stepped down from the carriage and stood for a moment on the platform, letting the stillness settle around me. There was no one waiting with a sign or a hug, no familiar voice calling my name, and that, strangely, felt like freedom. For the first time in my life, arrival didn't mean being expected. It meant being present. I walked out of the station slowly, suitcase rolling behind me, my body tired but steady, as though it had finally learned the rhythm of its own pace. The town was small and clean, its streets lined with row houses painted in patient colors, pale blues, soft greens, the kind that seemed to understand time. I found a modest inn near the harbor, run by an elderly couple who spoke with the ease of people who have seen many comings and goings and no longer confuse either with permanence. They gave me a room overlooking the sea, and when I opened the window, the sound of waves filled it immediately. It was a quieter sea than the one I had left, more deliberate, as if it knew the importance of listening. I unpacked only what I needed: a few clothes, my notebook, the jar of soil Henry had given me. I placed it by the window, where the light could touch it each morning. The next day, I walked through the town, unhurried. The streets were lined with shops selling simple things, wool scarves, wooden toys, jars of honey. I bought none of them. I had learned that ownership rarely equals comfort. Instead, I watched the people and the way they spoke to one another, the way they paused in conversation to share a small laugh. It reminded me that belonging doesn't have to mean being known by name. Sometimes it's enough to be part of the quiet hum of ordinary life. I found the address my old friend had written years ago, a small house at the edge of a hill. When I knocked, the door opened almost immediately, and there she was, older, thinner, but unmistakably her. We stood there for a long moment before she said, "I thought you might come when you were ready." I smiled. I finally am. The days that followed passed gently. We spoke little of the past. It didn't require retelling. Instead, we shared small tasks, walking to the market, cooking soups that warmed the house, sitting by the fire in the evenings with tea. Sometimes we didn't speak at all, and the silence between us felt like company rather than absence. She had her own scars, her own distances, and in our mutual understanding, there was no need for explanation. Life, I realized, doesn't always heal by confronting wounds. Sometimes it heals by creating space where wounds no longer define you. Letters began to arrive occasionally, thin envelopes in familiar handwriting. My daughter wrote once more, shorter this time, softer. She said she was glad I had found peace, that she had received my letter and understood more than she expected to. She mentioned that my granddaughter had started volunteering at a community center. Inspired by your garden stories. There was no grand reconciliation, no promise of visits or phone calls, just an acknowledgement, a bridge of quiet respect stretched across the years. I wrote back once, thanking her for the note and wishing her joy. After that, the correspondence stopped naturally, like rain that knows when to ease. Winter settled in fully, and I found myself writing again. Not letters this time, but reflections, small sketches of memory and observation. I wrote about the rhythm of waves, the patience of gardens, the way forgiveness is less a door that closes and more a window that opens quietly when the air is finally still. Some evenings I read aloud to my friend, who listened with her eyes closed, smiling. She told me I should collect them someday, but I think she knew I didn't write for an audience anymore. I wrote to keep my own company. One morning, near the end of the season, I took Henry's jar of soil and walked down to the shore. The tide was low, the sand cool beneath my shoes. I found a small hollow near a cluster of rocks, opened the jar, and poured the earth out slowly. It mixed easily with the sand, disappearing within seconds. I whispered a thank you, not to anyone in particular, but to every kindness that had met me on the way here. Then I bent down, pressed my palm into the damp ground, and felt the pulse of the tide beneath it, steady and certain. It was enough to know that I had carried life with me and left it somewhere new. That evening, as the sky folded into its deep winter blue, I sat by the window with my notebook and tea. I wrote one last entry, not for keeping but for closing. I used to believe that love was what tied you to others. Now I understand it's what frees you to walk away without bitterness. I set down the pen and watched the sea until it disappeared into the dark. For the first time in many years, I felt no urge to measure or remember. I simply was, and perhaps that is all peace ever means. Not the absence of pain, but the acceptance that some stories complete themselves without applause, without witnesses, in the quiet dignity of understanding. I thought of my daughter and hoped she would learn that too someday, not through sorrow, but through living. I closed the notebook, blew out the candle, and let the sound of the waves carry me into sleep. certain that the life I had now, the stillness I had earned, was not an ending, but a homecoming,